I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 26 of my series on the JFK assassination. Practically from the time it was established in 1947, the CIA was involved in the art of assassination. We know this because in the 1990s, during the term of the Assassination Records Review Board, a CIA manual on assassinations that had been prepared in 1953 was discovered. In this manual, it was clear that the CIA was studying different ways to assassinate people, including through high-powered weaponry. But was also revealing about this manual was that not only were they studying assassination, they were also studying the art of covering up their role in the assassination. In other words, preventing people from figuring out that this person who was now dead was dead because of the CIA or anything the CIA had done. In other words, keep the state-sponsored part of the assassination out of the equation. So they were specializing in both things, assassination and cover-up. Now, keep in mind that when the CIA was called into existence as part of the conversion of the federal government from a limited government republic to a national security state, that President Truman had originally intended the CIA to simply be an intelligence gathering agency. In other words, to gather intelligence around the world about the so-called communist threat and the so-called worldwide communist conspiracy to take over America and the world, and to give that information to President Truman so that he could make decisions accordingly. But somebody inserted some nebulous phraseology there in the law that brought the CIA into existence that the CIA seized upon and said, no, that gives us the ability, the authority to do much more than just gather intelligence. It gives us the authority to do whatever we believe is necessary to protect national security, a term that, of course, has no meaning, no objective meaning, but one that the CIA and the military and the NSA have the authority to define for themselves. And these measures included, according to the CIA, assassination, regime change operations, coups, invasions, and so forth. And of course, as the years progressed, the federal judiciary held that this was all in accordance with the Constitution, which of course it wasn't. I mean, if you look at assassination, this was one of the things that the American people were very, very concerned about when the federal government was called into existence. You recall that they weren't enthusiastic about this newfangled government that the Constitutional Convention was calling into existence. They'd been operating under the Articles of Confederation, which had a very weak federal government, a federal government that didn't even have the power to tax. And so, but they finally went along with the deal, but only on the condition that the Bill of Rights would be enacted immediately, which expressly prohibited, among other things, the federal government from assassinating people without going through a trial or a trial by jury with all the procedural protections, right of counsel, right to confront witnesses, and so forth. I mean, that's what the Fifth Amendment's about. No person is going to be deprived of his life without due process of law. But clearly, assassination does that. And the federal judiciary, recognizing that there was now a new sheriff in town, a new change in the government, even though it had not been done by constitutional amendment, effectively said this nullifies these protections in the Constitution. That the national security establishment from this day forward now has the authority to do whatever they believe is in the interest of national security. And that's one of the fundamental changes that took place in our governmental system with the adoption of the national security state way of life. So here they are in 1963, 10 years after this manual has been prepared, and you have to assume that the study continued taking place because they were continuing to assassinate people. The assassination manual was prepared as part of the preparations for the Guatemala coup in 1954. And they had an assassination list there, which reveals lots of things. I mean, it reveals that they're willing to assassinate a president, a democratically elected president, in this case a foreign one, that they have concluded is a threat to national security because he's reaching out to the communist world in a spirit of peace and friendship, which they considered, this is all or nothing. You're either with us or against us, and was clear that Jacobo Arbenz, the Guatemalan president, who had been democratically elected, was part of them, and so he needed to be removed. And Arbenz, of course, escapes the country and saves his life in the process. But even though they won't let us see the list of people to be assassinated, still they say national security would be affected or threatened if they let us see the list. Um, that it's a certainty that Arbenz had to be at the top of the list. So indicating that they were willing to assassinate a president. And remember, they orchestrated the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the leader of the Congo, right before Kennedy takes office. So it's a virtual certainty that they're studying, they're examining, they're probably having classes, training sessions, coming up with ways not only to assassinate people, but to make it look like the CIA has absolutely nothing to do with this. So as 63 approaches, we've already examined this war that is taking place between Kennedy and the national security establishment. Kennedy had already had the first altercation with the national security establishment at the Bay of Pigs, where he refused to provide air support, and they called him a traitor, a coward, weak, incompetent. And then he rejected Operation Northwoods, which provided the fake terrorist attacks and fake plane hijackings as a justification for invading Cuba. He rejected the plan for a first strike nuclear attack, a surprise attack on the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. He rejected the military's and CIA's advice to invade Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He struck the deal there that left Cuba permanently under the control of the communists, which the national security establishment said posed an irreparable threat, permanent threat to U.S. national security. And in fact, they were convinced that America couldn't survive with this communist dagger there 90 miles away. And then Kennedy throws the gauntlet down. He in his peace speech at American University, where he says, in which he didn't even consult with the military, the CIA, none of them, and where he just throws the gauntlet down and says, we're ending the Cold War. He had figured out, he had this breakthrough that said, this is a racket, just a racket. And he says, we're going to end it, which had to have stunned them, because this was not only the justification for their existence as a national security state, but in their minds, that's it. America's going to turn communist. That you can't have peaceful coexistence with the communist world. And here Kennedy was saying, Kennedy was even proposing a joint moonshot with the Soviets, which would, of course, meant sharing rocket technology. Imagine the alarm bells that went off in the Pentagon and the CIA at that one. And then he enters in the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which bans above-air nuclear testing, which they said was necessary in order to win a nuclear war against the Soviet Union. And then worst of all, he enters into this, from their standpoint, enters into personal one-on-one secret negotiations with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, who had the same breakthrough, and to end the Cold War. And so Khrushchev can't go to his national security establishment either. Remember, the Soviet Union was a national security state too. And so Khrushchev's facing pressure from his national security establishment. Kennedy's facing pressure over here. The two of them in this remarkable series of letters that you will never read about in America's public schools. They start negotiating, saying, hey, let's bring this thing to a stop. So they're both fighting their national security establishments. Not surprisingly, a year after Kennedy was assassinated, Khrushchev was ousted by his national security establishment. They didn't assassinate him, but they removed him from office. He was considered weak in the face of the so-called Western threat, the U.S. threat. So you've got this situation where this war is taking place between Kennedy and the national security establishment. Now, an interesting aspect of this is if we jump 10 years ahead to the Chilean coup, which the CIA did everything it could to keep the U.S. rolling this thing secret, even to the point where the CIA director, Richard Helms, committed perjury before Congress on U.S. participation in this, and even to the point of participating in the murder of two innocent American men, Charles Horman and Frank Tarugi, who Horman had discovered evidence of U.S. complicity in the coup. They participated in their murder at the hands of Chilean officials in order to keep them silent and in order to prevent people from discovering that the U.S. was part of this coup. And my hunch is that one of the major reasons they wanted to keep the U.S. Role in this coup secret was because it was very revealing with respect to the assassination, the regime change operation that had taken place 10 years before. Because here you've got a war between the national security establishment and Salvador Allende, just like the war 10 years before between Kennedy and the national security establishment of the federal government. And in this war, you've got in the Chilean war, you've got the Chilean Armed Forces commander, the overall commander, General Rene Schneider, saying, "We're not going to do a coup here. We don't like the idea that we got a socialist communist here that's been elected president, but we're not going to do a coup. Our Constitution doesn't provide for a coup." Well, the U.S. national security establishment, who, interestingly enough, considered Allende, like Arbenz, a threat to our national security, said, "No, you need to help us get rid of this guy, and not just to help us with our national security, but your national security. You can't survive." And Schneider says, "Well, look, we don't know that, but there's only two ways to remove him, and that's under our system of government. That's impeachment and election. So we're going to wait till the next election because impeachment had already failed." The U.S. national security establishment says, "You can't afford to do this. It is your job to protect the country from all enemies, foreign and domestic. This is a domestic one. And you have to protect your own national security. It's your job." Schneider says, "Not in our Constitution. The Constitution's not a suicide pact. If your country's going down, what good's your Constitution do? You have to violate your Constitution to save your country. It is your job. This is the job of a national security establishment." Well, Schneider wouldn't budge, and so the CIA orchestrates his kidnapping secretly, all designed to prevent people from figuring out their role in this, which involved hush money and stuff like that. But they smuggle in the high-powered weaponry under diplomatic pouch into Chile and so forth. And they always claimed that they weren't out to assassinate Schneider, but clearly that assassination had to be part of it, because what else were they going to do with him after they kidnapped him and removed him from the scene? They had to have been willing to assassinate him. But in any event, that's what happened. Schneider, who is a general, he's armed. On the streets of Santiago, the kidnappers go in there. He defends himself, starts firing back, and they shoot him dead. And once he's removed from the scene, then you've got other people that are now saying, "Okay, well, maybe it is our duty," and that's where Pinochet comes into play, and that it's his role to take over the government, save the country. That was the way they perceived it, and that's the way the CIA and the military perceived it. Well, the same thing happens over here. Now in Chile, the military simply attacks. You've got two branches of government, the national security branch and the executive branch. And the national security branch is where all the power is. I mean, government is force, and this is where the force is. They have an air force, they have infantry, they have armor, tanks. I mean, and the executive branch, has a few bureaucrats over there, working for the president. And so the attack takes place. I mean, there's an assassination attempt with airplanes firing missiles at the president's position. The president's wearing a helmet. I mean, this is an actual war between two branches of government. There's negotiations, should he surrender or not, and so forth. And at the end of this thing, Allende's dead. There's some indication that he committed suicide, obviously in fear of what they would do to him, which they were going to do. They're going to take him captive. There was no way the president could withstand this kind of force within the government. And not surprisingly, the federal courts of Chile became very deferential and began supporting everything the national security establishment was doing, much like they did over here in the United States. But over here, you had a different situation because you had a vice president who was willing to do the bidding of the national security establishment. And if you look at the record of all the meetings that Kennedy had where he had these disagreements with the national security establishment, it's clear that Johnson was always on the side of the national security establishment in this war. That he was on the same page as they, and they wanted to send combat troops into Laos and Vietnam. Johnson was right on board with that, which of course, as we've seen, I mean, that was another thing that Kennedy did that angered them so much. He begins pulling out troops from Vietnam right before he's assassinated. He issues an order saying 1,000 pull them out, and as soon as I'm elected, he told aides, I'm pulling the rest of them out. All part of this process of ending the Cold War. Johnson was vehemently opposed to that. He, as we know, after he becomes president and is elected in '64, he expands the troop levels to hundreds of thousands, and of course, the resulting catastrophe. So, so you've got a different situation here because all you have to do is elevate the vice president to the presidency, and so you don't need to have a military takeover in the traditional coup sense, like in Chile. Now, Johnson, as we've discussed before, had two roles in this operation. One was to get the body out of Parkland Hospital at all costs. Now, it was a certainty that there was going to have to be an autopsy here. I mean, to take the body out of there and then bury it without an autopsy, that would have raised too many eyebrows. Even among the mainstream press, they would have been a little bit suspicious about that. Texas law required an autopsy. Traditional criminal law involves an autopsy. I mean, an autopsy is designed to figure out the cause of death. It's standard procedure in any homicide, and this was a homicide. It was not a federal criminal offense to assassinate the president. It was a state murder case, and so the idea was get that body out of Parkland, get it into the hands of the military, so we can have a fraudulent autopsy, and we'll examine exactly why they did that, how they did that, in the context of what we've already learned about with respect to the autopsy. For now, Johnson's role was clearly get the body out of there at all costs, and that's why that Secret Service team starts going into action immediately at 1 p.m. when Kennedy's declared dead, brandishing their guns, pulling their jackets back, screaming, yelling, issuing profanities, forcing their way out of the hospital over the violent objections of the medical examiner who was saying, I'm going to conduct an autopsy. Texas law requires an autopsy. So they succeed in getting the body out of there. And Johnson's second role was to, as you'll recall, we discussed this early on, to conjure up the image of nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. 3 different times there in Dallas, he expresses this concern. Oh, this could be the first stage of a nuclear attack. But as we saw, his actions belie that concern. He lollygags. I mean, if you really are concerned even 1% that this is a nuclear attack, you get into the air immediately. You get to the airport, you get on Air Force Two or Air Force One, you get in the air and take off and direct America's defenses. He doesn't do that. He goes out and he asks somebody searching for a federal judge to swear him in, even though the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, had told him it was unnecessary. He's removing seats from the back of Air Force One to make room for the casket that he knows is about to be delivered. And he orders a luggage transfer from Air Force Two to Air Force One. This is not a man that is concerned even one tiny bit with the possibility that this is a Soviet attack. And the reason he's not concerned is because he's part of this operation, clearly part of this operation. Now, Johnson had every incentive to be part of this operation. For one thing, he always wanted to be president. I mean, he had this obsession of becoming president. And he knew, because of his age and his health conditions, that the only way he would ever become president is if John F. Kennedy died in office. Not only that, but Johnson was clearly facing the almost certain outcome of being sent to the penitentiary instead of ending up his life in politics. He was embroiled in these scandals, as we discussed, the Billy Saul Estes scandal, the Bobby Baker scandal. On the very day of the assassination, there was a hearing in Congress where a witness was about to implicate Lyndon Johnson in the Bobby Baker official corruption. So it was clear that the noose was tightening around Johnson. Life magazine, on the week of the assassination, was going to have an enormous expose of Johnson's corruption. And Johnson was convinced that Bobby Kennedy, at the very least, was behind a lot of the revelations of his corruption, which is probably true because Kennedy despised Johnson and the feelings were mutual. I mean, they hated each other. And John Kennedy had already told people that he was planning on dumping Johnson. Every indication was that he was going to do that. So if he got indicted, that would make things a lot simpler. They could say, Lyndon, we're really sorry. We would have kept you on, but now you've been indicted. And so Johnson had every incentive to participate in this thing because he instead of ending up as president, he had 2 choices. He could end up as president or he could end up as a common criminal in a federal penitentiary. And so, and the thing about becoming president, he knew he could squash all these investigations, which he did. The one that was in Congress on the day that Kennedy was assassinated never was brought back again. Life magazine never, ever brought up that expose again. There were a couple of newspapers in Texas, according to the latest volume on Johnson by Robert Cairo, that indicated that the two newspapers that were conducting investigations into this official corruption, Johnson contacted them, the owners or the editors, and threatened regulatory action or IRS action if they persisted, and those investigations were shut down. So Johnson had every incentive to participate in this thing. But the question still arises, what is the plan here, though? Because we're talking about the assassination of a president. We all know that if a federal agent is assassinated, it's no different from shooting a cop on a state level. I mean, everything is done now to find out who's killed the cop, right? I mean, all the cops swarm and try to figure out who's the cop killer. And it's the same with a federal agent. You kill a federal agent, and man, they're going to open up every avenue of investigation, even illegal ones, oftentimes, to figure out who did this. And so, assassinating the president obviously is going to unleash, federal power to the maximum extent. Now, keep in mind, though, that this is a state criminal offense. It wasn't a federal criminal offense to assassinate the president. But still, it's a highly dicey thing to be assassinating the president. So what they have to figure out is a plan, not only to assassinate the president, but a plan that prevents people from figuring out that this is a state-sponsored regime change operation. And it's that plan that ends up being not just brilliant, it turns out being absolutely ingenious in a very dark and nefarious way.